Hello friends, today we are going to look at what closures and callbacks are in JavaScript. What are they and how they are used with an example. Starting with closures. Now what are closures? A closure is a feature in JavaScript where an inner function has access to the outer function's variables even after the outer function has finished executing. Now looking at this with an example, here we have a function, outer function, and inside that we have defined an inner function. Okay, now here we have called the outer function. The outer function has an outer value and the inner function has an inner value. When we have called the outer function here, this entire block gets executed and that's it. Now when I try to access the outer variable here, outer value here, let us see. So it will show me that outer value is not defined. Means at this particular time when outer function has finished executing, the outer value here is no longer accessible. But if I call the inner function here, we can see here, we can see that the outer value is printed and inner value, of course, it is undefined. So how come the inner function can access the outer value even after the outer function has finished executing, and when we logged here the outer value, we could no longer access it. It was showing up an error as undefined. So here when the outer function is called, is executing, the inner function accesses the outer value and saves the outer value. So any time later when the inner function is called, it remembers this outer value and we can access it. Now if I pass some value here, suppose 20, we can see even the inner value is being printed. So this is what a closure is all about. It means the inner function has access to the outer function's variables. It is within this means it has access to its parent function scope or parent function scope. Also it is like it remembers the variables, it remembers the environment in which it was created and the variables that were accessible to it the time that it was created. So this is what all closure is. Okay, coming to callbacks. Now what are callbacks? A callback is a function passed as an argument to another function. Means it is passed as a parameter to another function. Now let us look at this also with an example. Here I have an ID array with some random IDs 1, 2, 3, and I have two functions. This add ID function pushes another value of 4 to this ID array, and this get ID function, it retrieves these ID values. Okay, now as expected I have called the add ID function, then the get ID function. So here the value 4 will be inserted into the array, and when I log it, I should get this array along with the value 4. Now let us try here. Okay, as we can see here, we have got the value of the array along with the 4 inserted into it. Okay, now what happens in this is, well, let us see the call stack. When JavaScript comes to this particular point, it has defined here ID array, and here when it comes and calls add ID, it pushes it onto the call stack, goes to the add ID function, pushes the value 4. Okay, when this is done executing, it comes to the get ID. Here again it goes in the get ID function, prints the value of ID, and then it's done executing. Now what will happen, suppose this add ID and get ID functions are associated with inserting a value into the database and retrieving a value from the database. Now it can be possible that this add ID function can take more time compared to the get ID function. Means the process of inserting a value into the database could be lengthier as compared to retrieving the values from the database. In that case, when the JavaScript, let us replicate this with the set timeout function. and we give it 3000 milliseconds, which is 3 seconds. Okay, so now add id function is lengthier or will take more time to execute than get id function. This we have replicated using a set timeout function. Means this particular add id function will be executed after 3 seconds. So now when javascript comes to this particular point of set timeout, it will push it onto the call stack, check that this requires some time to be executed, so it will send it to the web API to be handled, and it will take the next line of code to be executed, that is the get id function. Now it will go in the get id function, print the values. So now the value of 4 has not been inserted into this id array, but get id function is being executed, so it will log the value of the id array, that is just with these three values 1 2 3, and then when it logs those values, let us check here. See, it has logged these values 1 2 3. Now after that, when this timeout finishes here in the web API, it is sent here, and when it finishes counting down to 3 seconds, it will send it to the callback queue, and from the callback queue, the event loop, after checking that the call stack is empty, will push this add id into this call stack, and then add id will get executed and the value of 4 will be pushed into this id array. But this is not what we want. We expect the code to be run synchronously, just as we have written in this particular program, but it doesn't happen. So this gets pushed onto the web APIs to be handled, and the next line of code, that is get id, is getting executed. So we want to avoid this. This asynchronous operation, we need it to be executed in a particular sequence. Like first the add id should be executed, only after that the get id function should be executed. So this can be done using callbacks. This is where callbacks come into the picture. Now here what we are going to do, in the add id function itself, we'll pass the get id as a callback, get id function as a callback. Here we'll receive that as a callback function, and here we will execute this callback function. Okay, so now what is going to happen is this add id is going to execute the get id function, so the get id will never be executed before the add id function. Now let us just test this. Okay, see, here you can see that it has logged, first push these values of 4 inside the id array, only after that the callback function is called. The callback here is the get id, and then it is logging the value of the id. So only after the push operation has been done, the get id function will be called. So this ensures that the asynchronous functions are executed in a sequential manner, one after the other, as we want them to be executed. So this is the major use of the callback functions here. That's it. Thank you.